Congratulations, everybody. In settings, it's the position of the test line, screen adaptation of service, have become a tone master communication or settings all through travel. It's at all levels of remind. Is that a coincidence? Let's break that down. What does that say? Remind. Remind yourself equals lines of B-O-D-Y. The body conception of the operation of its directions, Y line screen adaptation of service. Remind. Right? Now the formation ground lines, high centers of relines, and set position location near track lines is rewind. W-I-N-D. Set course centers lines of high position location to a system, right? With over line, intelligence over sequence, networks and screen adaptations of directions, high set position. All right. Wind line, high center interference, high direct signals puts a wind factor over a screen. The adaptation sets locations at 111. Order communication lines at direct signals at 113. Setting track lines at 114 and position 11. Position lines at 5 and track centers. Process lines of summer, spring, winter, and fall. Center core lines of 5 line generations, fifth elements of screen adaptations of flux. All through tractions. Okay, welcome everyone. So, test is based on what you already know on line settings. The more you come in your coding system, you understand your holocaust structure of your cities is already done in the equation. The directions, operations, networking, your existing and travel. Done. Process lines of E and lines, operation surface in all lines of division. Road graph screen lines, of course, centers, location, grid, and travel. Process lines, inhibitors over screen, flux over line, directing signals, grounds, segment communication or pyramid. In communication system, all through 4 tractions in set position. Overline sequence, lines of panel, and graph communication setting. Energetic bubbles, directing lines of 3 lines of zeros, 4 lines of track centers of 6 over measure. Scale communication lines of 1 signal, 1 ground line surface, and track communication system, all through setting. Setting road graph screens, adaptations of flux over line. Process calculation over line, cross location lines and high centers into 4 line rotations. Setting communication setting into all levels of set position. Setting communication lines and grounds, center cross location setting, high operation sequence and high travels, and sonar of echo line and rotation surface of Zulu. So all I'm doing is setting schematics up, all through primer, all through tractions, which you guys already know through division. So let's get instruction line. Okay, so structure communication lines are 2 panels. Let's get in that position. There's 2 panels, right? Center core lines are 3 set locations, 3 wires of indication going this way, setting travel lines going this way, and opposite this way in traction. Direct lines, division lines are high set locations of scales of division. Center core lines, 3 circuits, line direct signals, grounds. Cross line settings over cross locations over line division location to a system. Setting communication high position lines of travel. Hooah. Center core lines of 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 traction. 1 earth, 1 set position operation surface and track locations. Setting communication of ground lines and configuration of face recognition. Ground lines 1, ground lines 2, ground lines 4, ground lines 6, and line position. Communication ground lines are high set location to a setting. So we go in position lines of 0 lines of tractions, 3 lines of zeros in setting, 2 over factors, crossing line setting, process lines of 1 signal, 1 track locations. Then we go into the other cycle, that's lines of space line, timeline sequence, and time panels. That lines up position location 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 position lines of travel. Directing core lines of settings over cross locations into 4 line divisions, in Skynet line division location into sky grids that process communication setting of travel. Setting communication open sequence, lines over 45 split lines of anomaly, and set track locations. Directing in modification lines to an X8000 and platform communication. Hooah. Bring it back home in sequence, back in panel, back in operation. All right. So basically, I need to see more lines of communications as we come into our webbing sequence and setting. All right, so understand how to get in schematics is all through track location through your Skynets. Okay, now what we all have to identify is the line screen adaptation, how it comes into the earth line. Setting ground lines as surface and set position location to its system, all through settings. So basically, understanding encode lines, let's go through COD and E interactions. All right, so we got E line centers, equal lines of triangulation, E platforms in box, and E travels in point lines of 0 and setting. Process communication code configuration system, all through travel. Directing signal lines of grounds, set lines of 2 track location system and line position. Communication lines of grounds over sequence. Line position locations into panels, track location lines of 0 gravity, equals lines of 2 panels in flux over line, and direct signals in triangulation flux over 1. Sets communication height, set location of travels, in line signal location system through its highways. Setting direct lines of panels, open sequence, panel lines, screen lines of adaptations and processing. Process lines of indication lines of 2 panels over cross location of screen lines of adaptation. Setting communication height center locations over cross lines, split lines of anomaly, and 4 lines of communication of double experiment, and 2 travels and point lines of communication. Directing signals, ground lines of surface, set course centers, lines of travel. Right home in sequence, back and travel, back and balance of coding. All right, so we got a code line settings, triangulation over flux, 3 lines of signals, process lines of indication system of satellite. Directing code signals, line position nodes Pluto, directing signal lines and ground lines of surface, and set track location system to 1 perimeter. Setting direct line signals into high position location of coding and 3 lines of panels in process communication. Directing lines of signals, code activation line, 1 factors over screen and adaptation lines of surface. Process lines of high center location into wormholes in line position. Setting communication lines, high center line communication system, open sequence, open panel. Directing lines of modification of 3 lines of communication lines of anomaly. Directing core lines of setting, another planet sequence over cross location system, all levels of Jupiter. Directing signals, cross line settings of 3 lines of angles, line position location of point lines of graph, and docking screen adaptation of processing. Directing communication line high center line sequence, sets lines of communication system through its projection and 3 lines of communication system, all through setting. Cross line course centers and ground lines of surface interactions. Bring home back in track locations, back in division. All right, sequence lines of panels is a direct line and modification of lines of grounds. Now we have to really understand how to get to higher lines of sequence. So lines of 9044, set position location 9 sequence, 0 gravity, 4 lines of signals, and 4 panels. So you have to get in more communications now because your highways are expanding your system out through equations. Ground line surface, ground line setting, ground line position. Overline, sig line, high center interference, trout, endpoint communications. All right, set lines of ground lines of surface as center communication. All right, configuration lines of 1, pattern lines, phase direction of 3 cycles. Setting ground lines, course centers, line direct signals, and ground lines as surface in 3 track location lines, high setting. Process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4, and mountain sequence. Direct lines exceed 1,000 in platform of 1 cycle. 1 center track position to 1 set position location of system sets all communication lines in webbing in sequence. So what you guys have to understand is to set up your webbing sequence through an animation lines of ground lines of surface. Setting ground line course centers, line signals, ground lines of high set position to its operation system, puts all levels of constellation paths and direct signals. Communication high center location setting opens all panels of communication lines of grounds. Back in sequence, back in balance, back in set position location of satellite. Boom. There's the satellite right there, travel. Directing lines as course standards, now we come into truth false narrative. Now what you guys have to understand is how to get in your webbing sequence. We'll start with a 0 gravity, equals lines of 12. This is where you guys come into your multiplications, your adds, subtract, and divide. Okay, it's very important to understand. So we're coming to highline course centers into trigonometry in your double experiments. We're going to be in a triple screen, directing lines of flux over line. Set lines of code sequence, setting track lines of position. All right, 0 line, you have to travel through the zeros to cross line signals. So the X3000 knows laser and track location. Direct lines of panels, cross line setting. Sets communication lines of ground lines of 1, ground lines of 2, ground lines of 3, and ground lines of 4, and travel. Sets communicates high center location system, all through traction and signature patterns and direct signals of ground line. Setting communicates high position location to its system, another X3000 and 4 platform communications. Direct lines of 1, Set lines of 2, 3, 4, and 5 lines of sequence and setting. Set lines of pyramid and direct signals and ground lines of setting. Set communication high position location to a system all through traction, all through division. Setting ground lines of service sets lines of communication setting cross lines, indirect signals into webbing sequence and direct signals and ground lines of surface and traction. Open sequence, open panel, line signals and set position. Bring it back home, track communication system all through travel, satellite. Okay, all right. So we all have to understand how to do a webbing system through our skynets and sky grids. Okay, it's very important you understand that on all lines of 4 different angles of travel. So what you have to understand is how to use the satellites in travel communications. Has direct line sight and coordinates over line. So let's go into coordinate lines, code signal line 1. So signal is SIG, okay, and then line signals are 2 weathers or 3 weathers into X line Y. Okay, so you guys have to get into more bracket screens and position, location, and measure. Scales communication lines of 3 cycles, 3 centers, 3 travel. Setting core centers of 0 gravity, 0 position, 0 calculations, and 0 grounds. 4 lines, cross line conditions, X box. Process core line signal location to its perimeters and set position lines of travel. Directing signal lines, ground lines of 1, ground lines of 2, ground lines of 6, ground lines of 8, ground lines of 12, and ground lines of 15. Setting lines of graph in communication order sequence, line generation, screen adaptation. Process lines X8001, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4, and travel. Setting communication light signatures, ground lines of 1, ground lines of 2, ground lines of setting and set position. Set sequence lines of panel and perimeters over screen, adaptations of flux over line. Directing color lines, back in sequence, back in panel, back in operation surface. All right, so everything I'm saying is all communicating your skyline grids and your satellite communication setting to travel. Now this has a direct line point lines of communication setting through 0 lines of 12 lines of foundation system. This puts all line coordinate centers. Now directing lines of communication on high settings, let's get into 20 lines of flux into equals lines of 7 travel. 7 signals and 3 lines of communications, only 3, right? So that 4 lines of sequence, divide lines of 2, sets course centers and bracket lines of 1. So that's 1 lines of signal and travel. So we take the 1 line perimeter, 1 line cycle line, high center interference, process communication lines of 4 over 2, sets position lines of time sequence times 1, equals lines of core lines of C factor, sets core lines as high center location of D factor, and set position lines of B over C, lines of E, sets communication lines of B over lines of D, and D position location to A, sets communication lines of B, calculation modify equals A, B, and C, and travel communication of the settings of D. Now getting communication lines of grounds is a center core system all through travel and mechanism lines of force. Bringing back in core lines of communication setting, back in travel, back in communication of solar sail. Directing signal lines at A lines, DF lines of 1, process lines of direct signals into the moon line track location system, all through calculation. Now the center core system has a line signal. The setting lines of communication system sets lines of volume. Now you center line the core centers and inhibitors over line. Direction setting, division. So we get X line of 0, equals lines of high position of box and frame communications. Home beacon light, X lines of 1, 0 lines of 2, 2 lines equals lines of F. Position lines of E, factors over lines of D, sets position lines of high center location of DX. Puts lines of X box and screen adaptation across line. Communication lines of ground lines of surface, open sequence, open panel, over contractions. Direct lines of parameters of 3 lines of communication setting to travel. Directing line course centers in flux over 1, flux over 2, and flux over 3 in line position. Setting communication lines of ground lines and position lines of pyramid. Directing signals, lines of set lines of course centers in cycle lines, high center interference of flux over screen, and 3 line communications. Now we have a divot over there in traction. See that? All right, that's a divot. Crosses lines of divot is a center core setting and mapping sequence. Triangulation flux, X8000 out sequence, line direct signals, and 3 lines of communication system, all through open line rotation. Directing core lines of setting sets lines of earth line rotation surface and track locations, security lines of panels, mapping sequence, mapping pi. Coordinate lines of 1, satellites of 2, and line position location of Earth that rotates the system into the central line, the inner line course centers, the interspectrum, the outer spectrum, the outer length, the line direct signals, and ground lines, communication surface, and track locations. Done by equation. All right, so center ops, the system to all communication setting in high lines. Directing signal lines in position of sonar and track communications. Direct lines and windows, frame communications of black holes that sets lines of course centers into the double experiment. Directing signal lines of ground lines of surface and earth line rotation in set position. Ground line communications setting a center line in set position and nebula in a 12-line sequence and travel. Sets communication height centers open sequence line position location measure and scale. Setting communication open sequence, open panel, open traction in colossus course center and oscillations. Directing signal lines of grounds, tubing lines of studies, and 4 lines of sequence, incisions over 1, set lines of communication of flux over screen, adaptation of the cross line. Calculation ground lines of surface, open sequence, open panel, open traction. Direct line position location of system, all through settings. In communications, back and grounds, back and signals lines of setting. Done by equation. Very powerful when we get a central communication setting to travel. Ooh-ah. All right. Setting lines of sequence is all calculated to modify how you come in your satellites of measure. The scale communication high centers lines of screen adaptations of flux over balance. Directing lines of flux over 1, screen lines of 2, and 1 xt1000 in a platform set position. Setting calculation screen line adaptations, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, open panel, open line position, and other satellite interactions. Directing lines course centers of sonar line 1, 2, and 3 lines of position locations. Setting line course centers back in home line set position lines of travel. Okay, a lot to take in through equations, eh guys? A lot to understand. So this is all done through a webbing system and line position. All right, this is what your test is going to be on Friday. So you see mechanism lines of force, portals and stargates, line direct signals, and ground lines of surface and set position location in your system all through inhibitors. It puts all communication setting to travel. So let's go through the box frame lines. We'll go through graph screens. Data process lines of files over sequence and set position. Now we have a ground line XT1001 and a mothership of 2 in track locations over lines of sequence. Then we have an XT24000 high setting. Process line mothership over line screen adaptations and 4 line set lines of high communication setting. Over lines, 1 panel, 1 operation, 1 stream, 1 direct signals and ground lines of surface attractions. Directing signals, high line communication sets and process communication setting security lines of measures. Highways and bucket circuits, setting lines of files, and 4 lines of communication of sequence and channel. Setting direct signals and ground lines of calculation setting. Now this process is all communication system, all through travels in your Merkaba, tesseract, and tetrahedron. Data files, process line is sequence lines of panels. Square roots, square line screen adaptations of box frames, Rubik's Cube. Set course centers and 3 lines of flux over line, directing signal lines of pi in set position. Process calculation heights, screen lines adaptation, all lines of wire sequence. Set communication lines of ground, similar lines of 1 traction, 1 division, 1 location setting. Set security lines of panels, 1/3, 1/6 over line, and set lines of 2 over 6, and line position over sequence, over panel, over lines, code signal, execute platform. Now directing lines initiate run, sets lines of intro, directing signal lines of ground lines of set lines, 007, calculation line general AI space-time, line position location setting, bracket lines of surface, setting line communications. Now this goes into code signal lines, power over charge, power over 1, power over 2, sets over cross location screen lines and inhibitors over line. Setting communication high setting puts all communication with atmosphere in colossus communication. Clocking centers. Clocking centers of 1, 2, and 3, sets lines of 4 over 6. Flux capacitor and line setting, rotation of surface and tractions. Okay, very complicated stuff. But this week, guys, come into higher lines, higher frequency, and schematics over line. You get a high direct signals, you know exactly how it comes in line rotation to a system. So the mind line screen sets lines of MI sequence, set lines of triangulation box in set position. Now the triangulation has a 3-line cycle and 3 lines of surface and 2 panels. Sets communication system, change core lines of direct signals into pyramids and screen. Parameters over 1, 2, and panels over N line, course centers, cross line connection setting on travel. 2-point lines of graph into another pyramid and screen adaptations. Process line 1, process lines of 2. Area inspection lines of 1, area inspection lines of 2, 3, 8, inlines, heights interference, XT1000 in platform. Directing signals, ground lines of setting 1, 2, platforms of set lines of E line. Directing lines and cross-line communication system all through travel and mechanism lines of crop circles of 3 clocking systems in 4 settings. Setting direct lines of panel, process lines of signal lines, High core centers of 3 platforms in track locations. Done by equation. Setting communication high position location to a system all through travel. Okay? Yeah, take your water. So this is what happens when you guys go higher in the mine. That's exactly what you have to understand through all communication setting, all through your satellites, interactions. All direct lines, guys, NEWS, northern, eastern, western, and southern. Coming into the constellations, all right, so we go into the double experiment. The splits, the core lines and 4 lines of signals, lines of ground lines of 1 and ground lines of 2 and process lines of 3 over a setting. 3 lines of signals, sets of communications. Then we go into electrical line charge, directing line, light bulb, and sequence line. Directing core lines of communication setting 1 position and 2 track communication triangulation flux over setting. There's the intelligence, safety. Track communication lines of grounds, set lines of brain convergence, directing signal lines of signature lines of panels, 007, line rotation of codex, lines of sympathic cortex, memory cortex, directing lines of hardcore centers, lines of travel, directing communication lines of high set location system, center clouds, E clouds, and line communication lines of service. Electrical lines of sparks, directing lines of high position location of flywheel, directing line communication system all through travel, directing line communication high set locations, high calculated modify interact locations. Done by equation. All right, remember all this is done through equations. Just a reminder. So you have to understand the central system to your satellites of communication. Satellites of communications, guys. Look at this in a 4-line communications, right? Understanding 12-line provision sets calculation lines and divots now. The divot line is a transmission of a data port. So it's communication lines of grids. Okay, it's a video line, voicing line chart, voicing panels, and track communications. All right, signal lines. High core centers, 1 XT1000 platform, 1 mothership and line rotation, XT1000 and 2 platform communication setting. Setting ground lines of service, 3 lines of signals, process lines of alpha. Setting core lines of set position lines of delta. Setting cross line centers of data and theta communication lines of box frame. Directing signals across line setting X box. Directing line core centers into flux over 1, platform over 2. Sets communication lines of platforms over 6 over 8 over travel that puts direct signals in modification grounds. Setting core line centers into waving line screen, directing lines of processing, line communication system, voicing lines of pattern, water containment screen, directing signals, modification of ground lines, high center interference, center core system, a center core system of travel, and mechanism lines of high center lines of power. Directing communication high setting puts all communication system off the calculation. All right, so we set the voice line box, high lines of charge. Now the direct lines come to 1 XT1000 platform. Waving signals into data into process lines of radio communications. Process lines of signals, ground lines of service in a 12 clocking system. 0 gravity and 4 lines of signals and process communication. Static communication lines of grounds, sets calculation of 3 lines of flux, 2 lines of signals into pyramid screen adaptations that opens all communication lines of high center location of coding, inceptions over 1 in position lines of travel that secure the position lines of panels and 2 track locations of provision. Your Earth. Your Earth. So you have a central line and configuration of face recognition, tubing screen adaptations in torical fields and line direct signals and travel, setting core lines of track centers, line direct signals, and communication system, all through setting. Back home in sequence, back in operation, back in set position. Your Earth through rotation. Okay. Now we go with divots over 1. Has a platform of data cross line and track case lines of high set interference, transactions over transitions. The transistors over resistors sets line core centers, lines of high core, high position your highways, H lines of tracks. Now we got 2 lines of panels, process lines of set position location to its setting. That communicates lines of data process lines of 4 settings into data process line 1 system in over cross location of screen. Directing signal lines of ground lines of 1, ground lines of 2, process line signal location of crop circles over 6. Setting communication lines of grounds, flipping the switch in travel communications. Earth line 1, set lines of separation into alls, quadruple in split in position location to its setting. Setting communication lines of grounds over line position location to its pyramid that splits lines of anomaly that 4 lines of signals in travel. Directing communication lines of high set location to its ground lines of service, transit lines of waving screens and omega set position location to its setting. Graphing communication high calculation setting is 0 position location to its system. The atmosphere line, energized line rotation surface and track locations. Then we go through core lines attractions. Look at that through equation. Then we go through the central communication line, high set position and travel. All right, go back home in sequence, back in position. Boom. Okay, recognition of lines of flight manifest. Now we have instructions over lines and perimeters. This lines of inner circuits. So we have 0 lines equals lines of 1 platform at L lens, height position of box line triangulation over lines in flux over screen. Directing chorus centers, change communication system to hieroglyphics and travel. Setting bound lines, high chorus centers into formation lines of grounds. Rocking sequence, rocking center. Process communication of crevice in 3. Directing lines, road graph screen adaptation of surface and pyramid. Directing signal cross-line communication system all through settings in communications. Directing 4 line centers and 4 lines of flux over line. Flipping the switch and direct signals in line position of 3 triangulation of the flux lines. Process lines indicate lines of 1 pattern. Position lines of 2 position location to its system. Routes, routers, line direct signals, and ground lines of surface interactions. 1 3 over 6, 6 lines of 1, 1 6 lines of 8, 8 lines of 2, 8 lines of 4, and 4 lines of sequence, high position of 0, and gravity communications. Skynet line, directed signals, lines of sky grids, sets communication high set location of cloud lines. Directing communication high variance line position of its Earth and rotation split lines of communication set to its experiment. Directing core lines into split lines of anomaly and 4 track locations and provisions of its Earth that sets its track location to its setting, your Earth interaction. Then we flick the line course centers in position location to its system. Oh yeah. Center core lines into 70,000 line settings. So process lines a high direct signal location system, all through laser, all through traction, all through division, all through cross-line signals. Setting communication lines of archetypes, flying and direct signals in the opposite direct signals and cross communication setting to travel. Boom. Back home in sequence, back in channel, back on operation system, all through calculations. Ooh-ah. All right. So this is all it is in direct signals. More modification of the structure line sets core centers to position location, your cerebral cortex, and your mystical. Setting lines of signal location, your endorphins, setting core centers into H. Sets calculation lines of triangulation over lines, run. Now we have a direct lines into line position EX. X line sequence, lines of T, sets position line triangulation. Process calculation line, grid signals, signature lines of panels, 007. Bracket center line position locations. Run sequence again in position lines of audio, interlines its connection system. Signature again, line position location of graph, in line position Schumann resonance that crosses line communications. Done by equation. Now we change the communication lines of grounds, we have a centric core system of travel. Direct calculus lines of XT1000 in-line rotations in front view and position. Sets communication high position location of floater and travel communications. Directing core centers, ground lines of 1, ground lines of 2, process lines of 4, process lines of 8, and set position locations. Setting lines of core centers into 1 set line position location to its system through a pyramid. Directing signals inside core centers, lines of travel. Directing line position locations, cross lines of 1, cross lines of 2, cross lines of 6, cross lines of 8, 8 lines of signal, 8 lines of panel. Process lines of setting, process lines of set position locations. Done by equation. Your pyramid through track locations. All right, setting core centers, line direct signals. Look at this. Your position location to your holographic gridding. Hoo-ah. Sets communication lines, flux over line, process line, and direct signal. Okay? Cross line condition setting into road graph screen lines adaptations over flux. Setting communication high centers and 4 lines of communication system. Metric cores, score lines, direct signals of flux over 3 in travel. Hoo-ah. Setting communication lines of center line directing signals that sets the webbing system in rotation surface and travels in Stargate measure. Setting communication high centers, open sequence line communication setting in process communications. Setting direct signals, location lines of grids, center core system over cross location and setting. Set lines of wingspan, indirect signals in the opposite directions of the set locations. Core lines of setting, process lines of 1, and net lines of signal lines of 3 over travel. Data process and data ports and 3 communications. Setting communication lines into all sequence lines of panel and colossal. Now the hangers come in line signal. Process lines an overline panel that overlines in position doesn't compromise the system of travel and set position lines of calculations. Setting core centers, line direct signals, and ground lines of surface in satellites communication. Your satellite again. Back in home sequence, back in panel. Hoo-ah. All right, so how's everybody doing in travel? Okay, I know it's a lot of fireworks of time sequence, but you got to understand how everything is created through schematics of its primer. And know exactly how to go through the graph screens, indirect signals, and correlate system location of solar cells. Setting communication lines of grounds. Let's go through the sun line, simulation line, position of 3 tractions, 3 lines of the moon. Set core lines of 1 sequence in yin and yang, and communication lines of flight lines of high center interference of yin and yang. Setting core lines of track centers in 2 line provision, 1 line cycle, 1 center, 1 position. Setting ground lines, core centers in the earth line, rotation of 3 lines of track communications. Setting core lines of track centers, line direct signals, and ground lines of surface in 1 next 8,000 platform. Travel point lines of graph and configuration of phase direction of time sequence. All through setting. Okay. Mechanism lines of force, set communication system, all through travel. Okay, setting core system and line direct signal location setting. What do we have in set position? What is that in tractions? What is that in tractions? What is that in tractions? Ostrich. All right, so the ocular line rotates the system and lines of travel, sets calculation the routes and system, sets communication high core centers in flux over 1 in position over flux over setting, sets communication high set location of nebula that crosses lines and line direct signals and ground lines of surface in set position of router. Setting communication high travels, indirect signals, and ground line communication. Bringing it back home, back in equation, back in center. Hooah. So, yeah, just smile and wave. It's too complicated for you guys to understand through travel. But what I'm trying to get you guys to understand your mechanism lines of travel, in position of clock, in position location of your compass, know exactly how to go through all sequence, all panel, all operation system of the mind. This interprets the line position of mind of inception. The high core centers and the data process lines of your theta sets all communication lines of ground settings. So you have process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3 over far, in set position of flux. Okay, so we go and signify ground lines of 1 over cross lines of 2, cross lines of 3, cross lines of 6, cross lines of 8, cross lines of 9, cross over, cross under, cross line conditions, process line setting, triangle line, high center interference, and flux over screen, direct signal grounds, set communication setting and travel. So what you guys have to understand is that you're looking through sequence. This is you looking at communication lines of sky grid line. Okay, so you're looking what you get in position of creating in set position your skyline. So you always have XC1000s coming in plateau because they have to understand what you're doing, knowing exactly where are you in, reminding where you are in track locations. So you can't get out of the equation lines because the XC1000s are all distributors, setting lines of thoughts, setting lines of action and emotions. Setting core lines of communication lines of pi over tractions. Now we go through flux line setting and process communications. Okay, so we have a symbolism lines of tractions and 0, gravity lines of 1, set core system, oscillation path, and 4 line communications. Setting lines of grounds and data process lines of 1 signal. Sets core centers and triangulation over flux over 1. Sets communication lines of grounds as center core system and travel communications. Now, direct lines of core centers puts all communication system all through center line. E factors are platform indirect signals into 3 lines of signals in position of 2 lines of windows and travel communications. Setting core lines of signals as center communication setting and communications. All right, so E tracks, 3 lines of perimeters over line. Wall sequence, ground lines is high position location of closing in procedure. Direct lines and high position location measure 1, 3, 1, 6, 1 perimeter, 1 parameter, 1 set lines, 1 core centers, 1 travel, 1 direct signals, 1 operation system in travel communications. Open panel through sequence and line communication. Complicated stuff, but you see the formation lines of its grounds in set position of its holographic structure of set design. So what you guys have to understand is how to basically get in the structure design in your position location. It's just a reminder that your holographic city is already set up in structure design. Okay, through the perimeters in position of wall sequence and electrical line grids in set position. Center core system, lines of travels, bring it back home in communications. There it is, the equation. Okay. I know it's a lot, eh? It's like, woo, okay. All right. It's incredible when you're really understanding what you're doing the high lines of sequence. Know exactly how to get into 4 lines of set lines of high communication system off the travel. Because that's all you're doing, guys. That's all you're doing in set position, is bringing things forward and position your frequencies now. Because it's already set in your structure line, design line. Then we got a structure lines of 1, structure lines of 2, structure lines of 3. That's the location of 3 buildings, right? So we get position lines of high position, XT1001, XT1002. We got an XT1000 line platform and XT1 position lines of travel. And we got a mothership in-line rotations on waiting signal line communications. 3 lines of high centers, XT1001 platform, XT1002 platform, set lines of XT1001 platform attractions. Directed course centers the Earth in rotation, in-line rotation setting to its dome in rotation to its surface. Future adaptation of cycles in set position. Setting core lines of attractions and direct signals. So I'm showing you how to create your structures of your design. So exactly how to use the modulation screen adaptations of flux over 1. So once you understand the holographic city, then you understand the mechanism, location, setting. You get the skyline grids, sets course centers in platforms. They travel through lines of set line position. Once they travel, they set up docking screens in position over line, setting direct signals and ground lines of calculations. Over lines of panels in communications. Changes the structures, look what we have in set position. Okay? Graphing screens. Graphing screens, they open sequence. Now we have panel course centers in the opposite signals and laser course system lines of travel. Has a direct line position locations. Welcome to Saturn and travel communication. So I'm trying to get you guys to understand the power of recognition of timelines puts everything in communications. All right? All right, so we split lines of communication and double experiment again in 3 lines of communications. You have a triangulation line position location to your teleportation vessel and direct signals at ground lines of surface. Okay? That opens all communication lines, high center location, your technologies and set calculations. Setting communication lines, holographic structure of your design line, that's all line position location system, all through panels, through the structures of your buildings. Setting core lines of travel, set lines of signals in lines and set position to its gravity shift line. Here, where's the 3 lines of communications? There it is. Structure lines of the Earth, your position location, Merkaba. Skyline grids, center course system of the Earth, routes, the routers, and line rotations that are going forward and attractions. Directing lines and magnetic force line communication system all through travel. Hooah! Go back home in sequence, back in operation. Okay? Whoa. All right, so once you get in that lines, once you understand the compass of your satellites, it gets a lot more easier structuration system with your schematics over your primers. You know exactly what you're doing with your skyline grids, sky panels, sky tractions, skyline, high set location setting to a webbing system all through travel. So that's what it is, setting the skyline grids in your foundation lines of 12. Now, line communication setting has a 12-line measure. Okay, that's 12 signals. Set position equals lines of 24. Now, the 24 indicates 1 division line in settings. The process lines of 24, 24 lines equals lines of high set correlations of 0. Because you're subtracting the line position location of 24 measure, setting lines of 23, 22, and 21, sets lines of 20 tractions, 21, 22, 23, 24. Sets communication of high direct signals into 20, 25 and track lines equals lines of existing position lines of travels into center course system, triangulation of box and line position equals lines into travel communication direct and redirect and set position. Whoa. So that's how we symbolize in 2025 in set position. Mapping sequence lines of high set. Okay, it's all set up position of 24 line sequence. All through traction, all through formula, all through equation. All right? Complicated stuff. But when I change the formation grounds, changes the existence of everything in set position. Different perimeters. Okay? Different highways. Different line communications. Different process communications. Different angle point connection settings. Track communication, your pyramids of astral travels and astral projection. Hooah! So understanding lines is knowing exactly what you're doing through your sky grid line communication, your sky panels. Setting up direct signals, start with the box line frame. Now you understand E equals M line core centers. Let's say E factors over 1 equals location setting. Box frame. Triangulation X lines a box. So we X box over cross location outline, wing line screen adaptations and divots. There's the divots, right? I know it's complicated stuff. Particle setting, separation lines of atom, cross line, one line signal, over cross location system, all through E factors over E, triangulation over line, direct signals of grounds, course centers, line connection set. Oh, looks like a happy face. Because it is, look. Happy face. There you go, Unison. That dude, $2 bill. All right, so directing signals over divots, cross lines of 1 over 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 lines of communication lines of flux over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, energetic domes and screen adaptation. Okay, so we go through the ground, setting line, communication setting all through its pyramid, through its mountain. X8000 comes above signal in the line position. Tunnels down and set position locations. All right, girl themes come in. 3 panels of communications. Directing lines of course centers, calculate and modify into over sequence. Home Depot, setting post and line position of outgoing mail. Travel lines, indirect signals that ground lines the surface and track location. All right, so we cross line communication system all through traction. All right, flux of course centers of pi sets communication split lines, directed signals that ground lines the surface, sets communication lines that ground communication system through an X8000 over lines of communication. And then we go to the center core system of its black hole and line communication with this happy smile. All right, so it's amazing what we do through travel in Mega's location of 4 set locations. Now, cross lines of X has a platform of 3 lines of communication XT lines, directing lines of 3 over line, interline core centers of travel, flux over screen, and divots over transition and direct signals, inhabitation, add lines and sequence in 4 communication setting. Setting communication lines of grounds correlates the system all through travel. Go back home in sequence, balance awareness, consciousness of its knowledge already in remembering cycle. All right. So what I'm doing, guys, is just basically how this is already set up is to perceive these things through consciousness through your webbing system. Okay, all through grid lines. Because what you have to understand, the inhibitors lines of one line cycle sets lines of communication near satellites and travel. Know exactly how to get in position locations, how you get into mechanism lines to understand how you are playing the instructions and the characters and the players that you bring inside the game, and how to get into the next levels of the game that you are, not the game that you're in. All right, so the game is lines of screen adaptation, high lines of sequence, puts in the mastering mind of its game, of its modulation. All right, so it's incredible what we're coming into, high lines of sequence, all through a mapping line, course center location setting, that puts all communication system, all through graphing communication in your Skynet. Your webbing system. All right, so it's basically understanding that position. So I went 150,000 lines, 3 lines of sequence, 3 panels of communications. Direct lines of 3 panels, cross line settings, a process of 2. Over cross location system, all through inhibitors. Flux over 1 in position lines of travel. Direct lines of panel, direct lines of pi. Oh, what have we got? High course centers. Setting communication lines of Pac-Man. See what I'm doing? Parameters over 1, crosses lines over 2 over tractions. So all I'm doing is setting up schematics in a drawing pattern. Laser track centers is always in order. The 0 lines, symbols, letters, numbers, and shapes basically put you in laser track communications, knowing exactly what you're doing in division of laser communication. Setting cross line settings when you got your energy lines, of course, center lines travel. Sets lines of communication lines of grounds, divots, and center communications. All right. Over cross location to screen adaptation to surface and track location. Setting back in sequence, back in panel, back in operation. Hooah. So you're here on the grounds in set position. This is all you through structure your hologram. It's hologram 1, structures of 2. There's this structure, there's design, right? Sets lines of course, centers, lines of travel, so 3 lines of measure. Okay, so you got 2 buildings, 3 buildings, and tractions. Now you set up the rope lines, thread lines of 3 line communication settings, sets up the threading through electrical line screen adaptations, in process communications. Okay? So it's all about understanding platforms at 24, 48, 72, 144, ground lines as surface interactions, setting up high core centers of center communication setting, equal lines, perimeters over screen, E factors over line direct signals and grounds. Setting communication high centers of structures into high line communication system all through platform, indirect signals in your holographic gridding in set position. Hoo-ah. All right. So I'm just trying to get you guys to understand how to come into your holographic cities and set design. How you see information lines in your reality through your frequencies in set communications. All right, guys? Yeah, but that's amazing how you come into that particular location and settings. All through emoji to a happy face. Woo! That's it, guys. If I keep going, you're gonna go. But it's amazing what we're coming into. Congratulations, everybody. I'll see you in 5.